Channel Introduction. Welcome back, night travelers. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Every week we tell another true crime bedtime story, a case that whispers even after the lights go out. Tonight we enter a place where doors lock, walls listen, and records lie. This is Hollowmere Asylum, 1987, and the patient who walked through a wall. Hollowmere, 1987. Hollowmere Asylum sits on a rise of chalk and hawthorn at the edge of Hertfordshire, its brickwork blackened by decades of winter. In summer, the lawns yellow. In winter, the pipes groan. Everything inside sounds tired. The radiators ticking, the window latches rattling, the long corridors sending footfalls away to die alone. The ward at the heart of this story was Ward E. Observation. A 60-bed warren where the lights flickered and the night shift learned to keep their voices down. 2 doors guarded it. An outer door with an iron viewer and an inner gate that scraped the floor. At midnight, both were locked. At Hollowmere, midnight mattered. Nurses joked about it like sailors joke about the sea. A new patient arrived in late October. The intake book, what's left of it, lists him only as male, early 20s, 30s, unverified ID. No family, no wallet, clothes without labels, clean but too big. He gave a first name once, then took it back. The staff pinned a number to his chart instead and called him Mr. H. His eyes were the sort you remember, gray as the river under cloud, a little unfocused, as if something was moving behind you and he was watching it happen. When they sleep. Mr. H didn't break things or shout. He didn't bargain, beg, or even ask for cigarettes. He sat on the edge of his bed in cell E12, toes just touching the scrubbed floor, and counted under his breath like a clock losing time. Nurse Elaine Carter, 3 years on nights, logged his first coherent sentence. "When they sleep," he said, "I will go through the wall." She laughed then, the gentle way you laugh for patience. "Perhaps he means through the door," she wrote. But he shook his head. "Doors are for people you can find again." He said it calmly, like weather. By the 3rd night, he'd stopped taking meals. By the 5th, he'd stopped lying down. He would only sit or stand, hands flat on the mattress, facing the east wall. He told one nurse the paint was too thick and asked if it could be thinner. The nurse, dutiful, noted perseverative thought content, psychotic ideation, re-architecture. At Hollowmere, language kept the world tidy. The corridor observation ward cameras came in pairs, one facing down the corridor, one inside the cell. In 1987, they recorded to tape, and the tapes recorded over themselves. The system liked to hum. Everyone pretended the hum was normal. On the night that would be remembered, the corridor camera worked. The cell camera did not. Shift change logged 23:58. Doors checked, bolts shot home, the smell of disinfectant like wintergreen on the air. Nurse Carter relieved Nurse Delgado. Orderlies did their round. Mr. H sat awake on his mattress, both hands pressed to the east wall, palms spread as if listening through it. At 0007, someone from upstairs reported a power flutter. The hall lights dimmed to sepia and came back. The tape creaked and the cell feed stuttered, 3 frames of static like moths at a window. And then the picture froze on a single image. An empty mattress, creased, still warm where a body should have been. The corridor camera kept purring. 6 figures. When the morning supervisor unlocked E12 at 0600, the door gave easily, the turning of the key unremarkable, the mechanical click a small, bright thing in the gray. Inside, the bed had been made, not hospital-made. Not the neat triangles of sheet corners the way you're taught. Someone had smoothed the blanket with 2 hands and left a small hollow where a head had rested. Mr. H's slippers sat side by side, toes pointing at the wall. On the paint above the mattress, in thick pencil scavenged from somewhere, there was a drawing, childlike, implacable. 6 figures, 5 tall, 1 short, all facing a blank rectangle. The rectangle was shaded, a door, a window, a space. The bed was sketched, too, an outline box. No faces, no names, just lines that knew what they were doing. A single caption, cramped in the corner, "After." The room smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, like coins kept in a warm hand. The absent body. The first question was procedural. Did anyone open the door between midnight and 6? The log said no. The second question was practical. Could he have forced a hinge, sprung the latch, lifted the frame? Maintenance said no. The hinges were intact, the screws painted over, the frame old but honest. The third question took longer to ask. Where did he go? Hollowmere had answers for everything except that. Security pulled the tapes. The corridor camera showed no one entering or leaving E12 between checks. The cell camera offered only that frozen still of the empty bed, time-stamped 0000914, as if the system had chosen a single moment and decided to keep it. Nurse Carter's hands shook when she wrote her incident report. She underlined empty bed twice and then crossed one underline out, embarrassed by the drama of it. The gently wrong things. After disappearances, Hollowmere had 2 on record before this, if you include the one chalked up to absconded in '73. There are always small wrong things that collect around the story like iron filings finding a magnet. A patient down the hall said he heard whistling where there was none. An orderly dreamed of a corridor filled with water. A junior doctor found his watch 5 minutes slow, then 10, then correct again, as if time had burped. Upstairs, on Ward C, Nurse Maureen Whitlow heard a sound all night. Tap, 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 tap. Steady as a metronome, faint as a mouse. From inside the wall, she told the ward sister, trying to smile and not quite making it. She wrote it off as plumbing, but later, at home, she put her ear to her own kitchen plaster and heard something like breath. When she learned the next day that a man had vanished below her at exactly the hours she'd counted the tapping, she went pale and asked for mornings for a month. The first undoing. The last ordinary thing that happened, before the records began to slide, was a small administrative mercy. The registrar noticed that Mr. H's intake packet lacked a photograph. She sent an internal memo to capture one at next med round. The memo came back stamped, unnecessary, discharged. No one had discharged him. The paperwork corrected itself before anyone could argue. On the master board, the strip with his number eased free from its magnet and fell, slow as ash, to the floor. When the ward sister bent to pick it up, there was nothing there. Nurse Carter, who had written his first sentence into the chart, "When they sleep, I will go through the wall," went looking for that page at noon. She found the binder still warm from someone's hands. The page was gone. Closing note. By midnight, the ward had a new bedtime story. The quiet man in E12 who left no track and made his bed before he walked through painted brick. It would be weeks before the staff understood the stranger twist, that the wall didn't just take the patient. It began to take the paper that proved he'd ever been there. For now, all they had was a drawing, 6 figures, a blank rectangle, a made bed, and the caption, "After." And a sound upstairs, tap, 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 as if someone on the other side of the world had learned your heartbeat. The arrival. October 27th, 1987. Rain had smeared the glass of the ambulance by the time it turned into Hollowmere's long gravel drive. The asylum loomed ahead, a black shape against the gray sky. Inside, the patient sat handcuffed to the stretcher rail. He wasn't violent, The cuffs were policy. The orderlies said he hadn't spoken since they picked him up from the roadside 3 nights earlier. No ID, no wallet, a shirt with the tag cut out, trousers that looked borrowed. His hair was short but uneven, as though someone had cut it in the dark. The admitting physician, Dr. Leonard Price, wrote in neat block capitals, male, approx, 25 to 35, no verifiable identity, speech absent, affect, flat, behavior, oriented to wall, notes, possible fugue state. But Nurse Elaine Carter remembered something else. She remembered him turning his head as they rolled him through the ward doors and whispering so softly she thought at first it was the rain. "When they sleep, I will go through the wall." The chart. The official intake form was sparse. Weight, 157 pounds. Height, 5'11". Eyes, gray, distinguishing marks, none. Next of kin, unknown. The box for reason for admission was left blank for hours until Dr. Price scrawled, "Psychotic ideation. Hold for observation. There should have been fingerprints. There should have been a police referral." Neither appeared. The form was filed anyway. Nurse Carter added her own note in the margins. Refuses meals, refuses bed. Speech, disorganized, possibly metaphorical. That margin note would vanish within a week. First night's cell E12 was standard. Bed bolted to the floor, barred window, light that buzzed faintly when dimmed. On the first night, he sat at the foot of the bed with his palms flat against the east wall. The orderly tried to coax him to lie down. He wouldn't. On the second night, he asked a question without looking away from the wall. "Do you know how thick paint is?" The orderly, caught off guard, said, "Couple millimeters?" The patient shook his head. Too thick to see through." By the third night, other patients complained. One said Mr. H whispered constantly, counting under his breath. Another said he never blinked. The drawing. During a routine check, Nurse Carter found pencil marks on his bedsheet. Someone had dragged graphite across the fabric, leaving faint figures. When she tried to take the pencil, he clutched it like a child holds a toy. "Why do you draw?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "Because paper doesn't last. Walls remember longer." She wrote that line into her notes. When she returned to review the binder 2 days later, her sentence had been replaced by a blank space. The strange tap. On the 5th night, around 3 a.m., Ward C upstairs filed a maintenance complaint. Nurse Maureen Whitlow described hearing a rhythmic sound. Tap, 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 tap. Beneath her floorboards, security checked. No leaks, no rodents, no loose pipes. Back in E12, Mr. H sat with his ear pressed to the wall, smiling faintly. The warning. By the end of the first week, Dr. Price scheduled him for a psychiatric evaluation. The plan was to keep him under 72-hour hold, then transfer if no progress. On the morning of the scheduled session, the patient looked at Nurse Carter and said quietly, "You should sleep while you can. You won't always get the chance." She laughed nervously and asked, "Why's that?" His reply, "Because when they sleep, I go through." She recorded it again. A week later, the page was gone. The ledger's first gap. When the hospital board requested a summary, Dr. Price leafed through the file to prepare. Intake dates were there, vital signs, sparse notes, daily checks. But the section marked patient statements was empty. Clean white paper, no ink, no indentations. He frowned, certain he had dictated notes about wall ideation. He called Nurse Carter in, asking for her margins. She swore she had written them, swore she'd underlined one, but her handwriting wasn't there. Instead, a single typed line had replaced it. No verbal statements observed. The counting nurse. Elaine Carter's first night note after the intake described it clearly. Patient seated upright, both palms to wall, whispering numbers in sequence, resists distraction. Sequence appears to reset every 120. He didn't mutter like most patients. His counting was steady, deliberate. 1, 2, 3, each digit crisp, as if he wanted it remembered. When she interrupted to ask what he was doing, he paused at 56, lifted his head slightly, and said, "There's a clock in here. I'm keeping up." Then resumed at 57. The tap 2 nights later, orderlies reported hearing him tap the wall in a peculiar rhythm. Tap, 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 always the same. Nurse Carter timed it with her wristwatch. The sequence repeated every 30 seconds. But after 10 minutes, she realized her watch had fallen behind the ward clock by nearly a minute. She laughed it off, blamed the batteries, but when she checked later, the watch was fine. It was her own memory of the minutes that felt wrong, as though something had borrowed 60 seconds from her and put them back slightly bent. The other patient's Ward E was never silent, but the others began to complain. One said, "He's making my teeth hurt. I hear him in my jaw." Another claimed that every time Mr. H reached 100 in his counting, the light above his bed flickered. When staff dismissed this as delusion, the patient grew hysterical, insisting, "He's timing something. Don't let him finish." The clock drift. Dr. Price finally scheduled an observation session. He brought a metronome into the cell, setting it to 60 beats per minute. Mr. H listened intently, counting under his breath, palms against the wall. After exactly 3 minutes, he spoke for the first time in front of multiple staff. "Your clock is late." The metronome continued ticking, but when Dr. Price compared it against his own watch, he realized it had slowed, as though the tempo itself had bent. Mr. H smiled faintly, turning back to the wall. "Mine doesn't slow." The note that vanished. Dr. Price dictated the incident carefully. Patient claims to hear alternate clock. Metronome discrepancy observed. Possible auditory hallucination. But 2 days later, when the typed report returned from transcription, that paragraph was missing. In its place, patient nonverbal during session. No remarkable behavior observed. Price was furious. He demanded the original recording. The secretary swore she had typed exactly what was spoken. The tape of his dictation had gone missing from the archive shelf. The nurse upstairs. Meanwhile, Nurse Maureen Whitlow on Ward C kept filing maintenance complaints. She still heard the rhythmic tapping in the walls at night, exactly beneath where Mr. H's bed sat below. When asked to describe it, she drew the same pattern in her notes. 1 tap, 2 taps, 1 tap. The sequence matched Hollowmere's old fire drill signal from the 1950s, a code the asylum no longer used. She wrote in the margin, "How would he know that?" That note, too, would later be missing. The warning. On the 10th night, as Elaine Carter checked his pulse, he whispered quietly enough that only she could hear. "You don't keep good time here. When the clocks fall asleep, the wall opens." "Don't be awake when it does." She asked, half joking, "And what if I am awake?" His eyes flicked to hers for the first time. They were terribly gray, like still water. "Then you'll go with me." The watching eyes. Hollowmere's surveillance system was old even in 1987. Grainy black and white feeds, looping to VHS cassettes that had to be switched by hand. Each corridor, each cell, a different tape. On the 12th night of Mr. H's stay, orderlies noticed something wrong with camera E12. His room. At first, it was minor. Faint horizontal bars crawling across the picture, a flicker at the edges. By 11:58 p.m., the feed showed his mattress clearly. Patient sitting, hands against the wall. By 11:59, the tape stuttered. 3 seconds repeated. 3 more seconds lost. And then, the frame froze. The freeze. When the morning staff reviewed the recording, the timestamp held at 00:07:14 for nearly 30 minutes. The picture was static, no movement. But the corridor feed outside his room told a different story. Orderlies passed, doors opened, shadows shifted. Time moved on. Inside E12, the patient did not move. His hands stayed pressed to the wall, face blurred slightly, as though the camera refused to hold it in focus. At 00:37, the tape jolted back to life, as if nothing had happened. The shadow stretch technician Gary Holt was called to check the system. He rewound the tape frame by frame. That's when he saw it. At the precise second before the freeze, Mr. H's shadow against the wall elongated unnaturally, stretching sideways toward the corner. It thinned into a vertical smear, like a doorway opening in the dark. Then the feed locked, and 30 minutes disappeared. Holt swore he'd never seen interference like it. The electromagnetic field, he said, looked wrong, as though something inside the wall had eaten the signal. The denial doctor. Price insisted the anomaly was mechanical failure. The asylum's wiring was decades old, the tapes reused too often. But when Carter asked why only E12's tape froze, while every other cell recorded normally, Price's answer faltered. He muttered something about localized faults and refused to discuss it further. The test. To prove the system was fine, Holt set up a second camera outside E12, pointing through the viewing slot. That night, 2 feeds would record him, one inside, one outside. At 12:03, the inside feed began to flicker. At 12:05, the outside camera, brand new, showed the patient sitting still, hands on the wall. At 12:09, both feeds froze. When the picture returned at 12:31, the outside camera showed the bed neatly made, empty. But the inside feed still showed him sitting there, motionless. The staff meeting. The next morning's meeting was tense. Dr. Price insisted the freeze proved nothing. Carter argued the tapes contradicted each other. Holt wanted the equipment replaced immediately. When the ward sister tried to check the tapes herself, she found them blank. Both had been recorded over within hours, though no one admitted switching them. The log simply noted, tapes recycled, 8 a.m. The whisper. That night, Carter confronted Mr. H during meds. "Do you know what the cameras show?" He turned his head slowly toward her. His voice was almost kind. "They don't show what happens. They show what's allowed to be seen." She whispered, "Allowed by who?" He placed his palm back on the wall. "By the ones who built the clocks inside." The inquiry. By the second week of Mr. H's stay, Hollowmere's administration could no longer keep the anomalies quiet. Reports of frozen tapes, unexplained sounds, and a patient with no history had spread through the staff like fever. On November 6th, Hertfordshire Constabulary dispatched 2 detectives to conduct a routine welfare check. Detective Inspector Colin Ward and Sergeant Julia Finch. The official reason was simple: verify the presence of a patient with unverifiable identity. But everyone understood it as something else. The asylum was worried he might vanish the way their records already seemed to. The cell ward and Finch entered cell E12 just before noon. The door opened normally. The lock was intact, the hinges firm. Inside, the bed was made, too neatly. The sheets smoothed as if by careful hands, slippers aligned. On the east wall, faint but unmistakable, someone had drawn with pencil scavenged from somewhere. 6 figures, tall and thin, surrounding a rectangle. A 7th shape, a bed, crudely outlined. The rectangle shaded black. No faces, no names, just a caption in cramped handwriting. After. The forensics. The detectives called for a forensic sweep. Powder tests revealed smudges, not fingerprints exactly, but impressions too broad and flat, like palms pressed hard into the plaster. Sergeant Finch asked an orderly, "Do patients normally get pencils?" He shook his head. "Not unless supervised. We lock them in the nurse's station." When they checked the station, a pencil was missing. No one signed it out. The statement's ward interviewed Nurse Elaine Carter. She recounted the patient's words. "When they sleep, I will go through the wall." Finch frowned. "And you wrote that down?" Carter nodded. "Yes, twice." But when Finch asked to see the file, the statement wasn't there. The section marked patient verbal notes was empty. Ward muttered, "Convenient." Carter swore, near tears, "I wrote it. I know I did." The tapping above. Before leaving, the detectives asked if anyone else had noticed unusual behavior. Nurse Maureen Whitlow from Ward C admitted she had heard tapping in the walls directly above E12. Tap, 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 all through the night of November 3rd. Ward recorded it in his notebook. Hours later, when he flipped back to review, that page was blank. The corridor camera. As a final step, they requested the corridor footage from the nights in question. The technician brought the tape. It showed orderlies walking, doors opening, shadows shifting. But at 00:07 on November 3rd, the frame jolted. And for 1 second, there were 7 shadows in the corridor, though only 6 people were on the ward. The 7th shadow stood directly outside E12, motionless, longer than the others, as if it belonged to someone taller. Then the frame snapped back. The report ward filed an interim report that afternoon. Patient cannot be confirmed. Cell secured, but contents unusual. Drawing on wall suggests organized ideation. Audio, visual anomalies recorded. He underlined one sentence 3 times. If patient exists, risk of elopement is high despite secure environment. A week later, when the file was pulled for follow-up, that sentence was gone. Instead, the page read, "No patient of this description currently at Hollowmere." The quiet panic. Inside Hollowmere, staff whispered now. Some swore they'd seen the drawing change, figures multiplying, shadows darkening. Others said the bed in E12 always felt warm, even when empty. Carter, exhausted, told a colleague, "He's not trying to escape. He's waiting. He knows when." The colleague asked, "When what?" Carter's answer was a whisper, "When we sleep." The doubt Detective Inspector Colin Ward couldn't shake Hollowmere from his head. Officially, his report was filed, neat and clean. No patient matching description currently housed. But Ward wasn't satisfied. He kept remembering the drawing, 6 faceless figures, the shaded rectangle, the word after. He remembered Nurse Carter's trembling voice. "I wrote his words down, twice. They're gone now." And most of all, he remembered the corridor tape, the 7th shadow. So on November 9th, 3 nights after the inquiry, he drove back to Hollowmere. No partner this time, no authorization, just curiosity, or maybe guilt. Hollowmere at night. The asylum was different at night. The windows glowed faintly, the corridors hummed with the sound of radiators. But the building felt empty, despite holding hundreds of patients. The duty nurse hesitated when Ward flashed his badge. "We weren't told about another visit." Ward lied easily. "Follow-up won't take long." He walked the halls alone, notebook in pocket, shoes echoing. At 11:57, he stood outside cell E12. The door was locked. The viewing slot was dark. Inside, only silence. The tapping begins. Then he heard it. Tap, 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 steady, rhythmic, coming from inside the wall. He pressed his ear closer. The plaster felt cold, almost damp. The tapping didn't echo like pipes or radiators. It was sharper, deliberate, like knuckles on wood. Ward whispered, "Hello?" The tapping paused, then resumed, faster now, like a reply. The notebook Ward flipped open his notebook, jotting the sequence down. As he wrote, the taps seemed to mimic his pen strokes, one beat for each letter. When he stopped writing, the taps stopped too. He glanced down at the page. What he had written was simple. Tap, 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 tap. But beneath it, in faint pencil marks he hadn't made, another sentence appeared. When you sleep, I will go through. The corridor shift. Heart hammering, Ward stepped back into the corridor. The lights flickered. For 1 second, the shadows on the floor stretched long, impossibly long, reaching toward him. And there, at the end of the hall, he thought he saw someone. Tall, thin, standing still, gray eyes catching the dim light. Ward blinked, and the corridor was empty again. The panic. He stumbled out, forcing himself to keep his pace calm until he reached the exit. The night air outside was sharp, freezing his lungs. He sat in his car for 10 minutes before daring to turn the key. When he checked his notebook again, the new sentence was gone. Only the taps remained. But the impression of pencil marks lingered, faint indentations in the paper. The choice ward never logged this visit. He couldn't. Who would believe him? But he told himself he'd return, next time with Finch, next time with proof. For now, he only repeated the line in his head. When you sleep, I will go through. And he wondered, with dread, what would happen if the asylum itself ever fell asleep. The Morning Review. On November 10th, Dr. Leonard Price arrived for morning rounds with his usual coffee and clipboard. He had slept poorly. Hollowmere's gossip about the man in E12 was spreading faster than discipline could contain it. He wanted proof, notes, numbers, something firm to slap down on the table. But when he opened the patient's file, the first thing he noticed was absence. The missing pages. The intake form, once sparse but intact, was thinner now. The weight, height, and eye color had vanished. The box for reason for admission was blank again. The physician's signature at the bottom faded, as though scrubbed by time. Even his ID number, once written in thick marker on the cover, was faint. Dr. Price frowned, flipping through. The margin notes by Nurse Carter were gone. His own dictations on wall ideation had disappeared. In their place, blank paper, clean, white. The panic. He called Carter into his office. "Where are your notes?" She looked at the file, confused. "They should be there. I logged every statement, the wall, the counting, the—" "Not anymore!" He slammed the binder shut. "There's nothing here. Nothing!" Carter's face went pale. "Then it's happening to the chart, too." The archivist. They checked the master ledger at records. Each patient had a line, admission date, ID, attending physician, for Mr. H. The line was faint, blurred, like ink left in the rain. By evening, the line had vanished completely. The archivist muttered nervously, "We've had smudges before, but never erasure. It's as if he was never admitted." The other staff orderlies grew restless. One swore he remembered escorting the man to his cell, but when asked for details, the shirt he wore, the cut of his hair, his mind went blank. Another insisted she had given him water, yet couldn't recall his voice, only the sound of tapping. By the end of the shift, staff whispered openly, maybe he wasn't real at all. The drawing returns. That night, Carter checked cell E12 again. The pencil drawing on the wall had changed. Now, instead of 6 figures, there were 5. One had vanished. The rectangle was darker, heavily shaded, and the caption beneath no longer said "after." It now read, Now. The doctor's note. Dr. Price tried one last time to anchor reality. He opened his private notebook, not hospital-issued, just his own leather-bound journal. He wrote in heavy strokes, "Patient exists. I have seen him with my own eyes. If this record fades, I will not trust myself. Remember this. E12. Gray eyes. Went through walls." He underlined it twice. The next morning, he found the page torn out. The official record. By November 12th, the Hollowmere patient register listed cell E12 vacant. The archivist, pale and sweating, insisted there was no error. "The room's empty. The chart's gone. It's as though he was never here." Dr. Price barked at him. "He was admitted under my signature." But the archivist only shrugged helplessly. Not anymore. The words chilled everyone in the room. The nurse's sight. That night, during rounds, Nurse Elaine Carter unlocked E12 to prove the archivist wrong. She opened the door and gasped. The man was still there, sitting upright on the bed, palms flat against the east wall. His gray eyes slid toward her. He smiled faintly, as if expecting her. "You're late," he whispered. The confusion. Carter ran back to the nurse's station. "He's there! He's still in E12!" But when another nurse, Linda Farrow, checked with her, the room was empty. The bed neatly made, the slippers aligned, the drawing on the wall faint but visible. Farrow shook her head. "You need sleep. There's no one in that room." Carter's hands shook. "I saw him. He spoke to me." Farrow looked at her with pity. "Then write it down." So Carter did. The erasure. In her shift report, she scrawled in heavy letters, "At 0114, I observed patient in E12. He addressed me directly." When she checked the report at dawn, the words were gone. The page was blank. The patient's words. That evening, Carter confided in Dr. Price. "He's still there, even if the records say he isn't. He told me I was late." Price, exhausted, rubbed his temples. "Late for what?" Carter whispered. "For when the walls open." The witness. On November 13th, a young orderly named Gavin checked the dorm. Later, he swore he glimpsed movement in E12, a shadow shifting, a head turning. But when he opened the door, there was nothing. Only the faintest sound. Tap, 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 tap. He refused to do night rounds after that. The drawing changes again. By the next morning, the drawing on the wall had shifted once more. Now there were 4 figures around the rectangle. The bed outline was gone. The caption had changed too. It no longer read after or now. It read soon. The session. On November 14th, Dr. Leonard Price scheduled a private session with Mr. H. The patient's chart was gone, the ledger line erased, but Price was determined. "If the records vanish, I'll make new ones," he muttered. He entered cell E12, sat across from the man on the bed, and pressed record on his handheld dictaphone. For 30 minutes, he asked questions. Name. Age. History. The patient barely moved. His palms stayed pressed to the wall, his lips moving in soft numbers. Finally, Price demanded, "Why this wall? Why not the door?" The man turned, gray eyes flashing. "Doors are for those who return. I won't." Price felt a chill. He pressed further. "Where will you go?" The man smiled faintly. "Through." The dictaphone. When Price left the cell, he clutched the recorder like a lifeline. That evening, he replayed the tape. It contained nothing but silence. No questions, no answers, no voice, only faint static, and beneath it, a steady rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. the colleagues. The next day, Nurse Carter approached him. "He told you something yesterday, didn't he? About the wall?" Price frowned. "How do you know?" She said, "You came out of the room pale as paper. You told me he said, 'Doors are for those who return.'" Price froze. I don't remember saying that." Carter's eyes widened. "But I wrote it in my notes." When she checked her report, the line was gone. Blank space again. The fragmented mind. That night, Price couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, trying to reconstruct the session. His memory was slippery, like wet glass. He could recall sitting, speaking, but not the patient's face, not his own words. When he checked his private journal, he found a new entry in handwriting that looked like his, but shakier. He said he won't return. He said he'll go through. I don't remember writing this. The yawning gap. Price confronted Carter the following morning. "If I'm losing memories, how can I prove anything?" She whispered, "Maybe you're not losing them. Maybe they're being taken." "By who?" Her answer was quiet, terrified. "By whatever keeps the clocks inside the walls." The drawing again. When they checked cell E12 together, the drawing had changed once more. Now only 3 figures stood around the rectangle. The caption below read, "Awake." Carter trembled. "It's counting down." Price whispered, almost to himself. "Counting down to what?" From inside the wall came the faintest reply. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. The night shift ward. C was quieter than most. Its patients were sedated, its halls less restless than the observation wing below. On November 15th, Nurse Maureen Whitlow worked the night shift alone. She was tired, her body running on coffee and nerves. The rumors from E12 weighed heavily, though she laughed them off with colleagues during the day. At night, she didn't laugh. The tapping returns. Around 2:14 a.m., the familiar rhythm began beneath her floor. Tap, 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 tap. Whitlow froze. She had heard it before, filed maintenance reports, been told it was pipes. But tonight it was louder, sharper, like knuckles striking plaster. She tried to distract herself with charting, but the taps synced with her pen strokes, as though mocking her. The bulge. At 2:27 a.m., the wall beside her desk began to bulge outward. At first, it looked like moisture blistering plaster, a soft rise spreading in the dim light. Then she saw fingers, 5 of them, pressing from the inside out, stretching the paint into pale shapes. The fingertips flexed, straining, as though trying to claw their way through. Whitlow screamed and stumbled back. The witness. Another nurse, Linda Farrow, rushed from the ward kitchen at the sound. She found Whitlow pointing at the wall, trembling. The bulge was gone, the plaster smooth. Farrow checked. Nothing unusual. No cracks, no damp. But Whitlow swore. There was a hand. Right there. It pressed out. It was alive. Farrow called for maintenance again. The report. In her written statement, Whitlow described the event clearly. 5 fingers visible. Motion consistent with grasping. Appeared to be a left hand. Duration, approximately 7 seconds. By morning, her report was missing from the file. In its place was a single-typed sentence. Staff member experienced fatigue-related hallucination. The aftermath. Whitlow refused to work nights again. She transferred to another ward within the month, but in private she told Carter, "It wasn't a hallucination. The wall was thin, Elaine. Too thin. Something's inside." The drawing. That same morning, in cell E12, the pencil drawing had changed again. Now there were only two figures left around the shaded rectangle. The caption read, "Open." The returned detective Colin Ward had sworn he wouldn't go back alone. His notebook still carried the faint indentations of words he hadn't written. "When you sleep, I will go through." So on November 16th, he returned to Hollowmere with Sergeant Julia Finch. She was skeptical, calling it ghost stories in Scrubs, but she trusted Ward enough to humor him. "This is still a police matter," he reminded her. "There was a patient, there was an intake, and now there isn't. That's not folklore. That's evidence disappearing, the corridor camera." They requested to review camera E12, the corridor feed outside the patient's cell. Technician Gary Holt, pale and jumpy, wheeled out the tape machine. He admitted he had been replacing reels twice as often because of corruption. At 0013 on November 14th, the footage showed Nurse Carter walking past the door. At 0014, she was gone. Not walked out of frame, not cut away. She simply blinked out. One frame she was there, the next she wasn't. The corridor background remained seamless. At 0015, she reappeared halfway down the hall, mid-step. The impossible edit. Finch frowned. "Splice?" Holt shook his head. "Continuous recording. No interruption. She just wasn't there for 40 seconds. Ward leaned closer. "Show me again." They replayed the segment. Carter walking. A flicker of static. Empty corridor. Carter reappearing. Each time, the missing 40 seconds showed nothing but an empty hall. The experiment. To test it, Finch insisted on a live demonstration. At 11:50 that night, she walked the corridor while Holt monitored the feed in real time. Ward watched through the viewing slot of E12. Finch paced steadily, boots echoing on the linoleum. But on the monitor, halfway down the hall, she flickered and vanished. The screen showed only empty floor. Ward spun to the actual corridor. Finch was still there, walking. When she reached the end of the hall and turned back, the monitor flickered again. She reappeared. The panic in the room. Finch's face was drained of color when she returned. That wasn't a malfunction. That was deliberate. Ward nodded grimly. "It's not just erasing the patient anymore. It's erasing anyone who gets too close." Holt muttered, "The walls decide what the cameras see. The cameras don't record us. They record what the asylum allows." The notebook again. Ward scribbled the test results into his notebook. He underlined twice. "Reality persists. Record denies." But when he closed the notebook and opened it again, the words were gone. Instead, faint indentations read, "Soon there will be one." The drawing. The next morning, the drawing in E12 changed again. Now only one figure remained by the rectangle. The caption read, "Here." Finch's instinct sergeant, Julia Finch, didn't like chasing shadows. Cameras glitch, nurses fatigue, memory fails. Those were explanations she could live with. But the footage she'd seen with her own eyes, herself erased in real time, rattled her in ways she refused to admit. She told Ward, "If this has happened before, someone must have spoken. Places like this keep secrets, but secrets always leak." So she began calling ex-staff. The name. After 2 days, she found one. Nurse Margaret Allerton, retired in 1975. She'd worked Hollowmere for 30 years. Finch met her in a small flat in Watford. The woman was frail, but her eyes were sharp. She lit a cigarette, and when Finch asked about patients with no names, her hand trembled slightly. "So it's happening again." The first story. Allerton leaned back. Smoke curled around her. "In 1954, we admitted a man. No papers, no relatives. just dropped off by police who didn't want to keep him. They said he'd been found wandering the motorway. He never gave his name, barely spoke, but when he did, she shivered. He said almost the same words you're telling me now. When they sleep, I'll walk through. The Vanishing. She told Finch that one morning his room was empty, door still locked, bed made. They searched the grounds for days, nothing. Then, the file disappeared. Admission record gone. My own notes were missing. Even the fingerprints we took were smudged like bad ink. It was as if he'd never been. Allerton tapped ash into a tray. By the end of the week, staff were ordered never to mention him again. The director called it a clerical error. The pattern Finch asked, "Did it happen again?" Allerton's silence was long. Finally, she nodded. "Twice more before I left. Always the same. Always men with no names, and always the walls." She leaned forward. "I heard it too, you know. The tapping. Like someone trying to get out. Or in. The warning." Before Finch left, Allerton caught her sleeve. "Tell your friend, tell him not to write anything down. The walls like to borrow words. They last longer on paper than in memory. That's why they take them first." Her eyes glistened. "Don't let him forget who he is." The return to Hollowmere. Back at the asylum, Finch relayed what she'd heard. Ward was pale, jaw clenched. "That's 3 disappearances before ours, maybe more, and each one erased." Carter whispered, "So it's not a patient we're watching. It's a pattern." The drawing. That night, the drawing in E12 changed again. The last figure was gone. Only the rectangle remained. The caption read, "Open." The escalation. By November 18th, the atmosphere in Hollowmere had curdled. Patients were restless, orderlies on edge. Even the most skeptical staff whispered that Ward E felt wrong. The tapping no longer came softly. It slammed through the plaster, rattling light fixtures and making floorboards tremble. Nurse Elaine Carter swore she saw dust sift down from the ceiling every time it struck. The pounding. At 1:43 a.m., the sound shook Ward C so hard that a framed emergency map fell from the wall. Nurse Maureen Whitlow, who had once seen the hand, clutched her ears and cried, "It's trying to get out!" But Dr. Price muttered something darker. "Or trying to pull us in." The first voice. That same night, Orderly Gavin rushed into the station, face white. "I heard him," he stammered. "Not tapping, speaking. He said my name." When pressed, Gavin insisted he heard the voice inside the wall itself, low and muffled, like someone calling from the other side of plaster. "Gavin, come through." He refused to patrol alone afterward. The spread. By the next shift, more staff had the same story. A nurse claimed the wall whispered her childhood nickname. An orderly swore the voice recited his address. "Doctor." Price admitted reluctantly that while walking past E12, he heard his mother's voice calling him from within. All described it the same way. Close, wet, as though lips pressed against plaster the corridor camera. Again. Detectives Ward and Finch reviewed corridor tapes once more. At 2:00 a.m., the pounding shook the camera itself. Dust fell across the lens. For 3 frames, faint shapes flickered across the plaster of E12. Faces pressed against it from the inside, mouths open as though screaming silently. Then the picture froze. When it resumed, the wall was blank again. Carter's terror. Nurse Carter broke down during her statement. "It's not just his voice. It's everyone's. Voices I know, voices I don't. They're all inside, and they want us to listen." When Finch asked what the voices said, Carter sobbed, "They tell me to sleep. They tell me it's easier if I don't wake up." The drawing once more. On November 19th, the drawing changed again. The rectangle had widened into a crude doorway. No figures remained. The caption beneath was a single word: "Here." The unease spreads. By November 20th, Hollowmere no longer whispered. It roared. The staff spoke in clipped sentences, their eyes darting to walls as though expecting them to breathe. Dr. Price walked with a flask of whiskey tucked into his coat. Carter had stopped sleeping. The administration insisted everything was under control, but the asylum itself seemed restless. Ward B, Room 7. At dawn, an orderly entered Room 7 on Ward B to distribute breakfast. The door was locked. The patient, Harold Sims, a 40-year-old schizophrenic long-term resident, was expected inside. The bed was made. The slippers were aligned. The tray from the previous night sat untouched. But Harold was gone. The frantic search. The staff tore through the ward. Doors were locked, windows barred, hallways watched. There was no trace of him. Detective Ward, summoned immediately, paced the room. It's happening again. Exactly the same way. Bed, slippers, absence. Finch whispered, "Then Mr. H wasn't unique. He was the beginning." The mark on the wall above Harold's bed was a new drawing, not pencil this time, gouged into the plaster itself. A rectangle, wider now, with a stick figure half inside, half out. Beneath it, one word carved deep: "Through." The other patients. 3 patients on Ward B reported the same nightmare that night, standing in a long corridor, walls pulsing like lungs. Hearing Harold's voice say, "Don't follow me," watching him step into the wall and vanish. They told the dream to different nurses in separate interviews. Every detail matched. The record erasure again. By evening, Harold's file had begun to fade. The intake form was smudged. The line on the register blurred. By midnight, it was gone. Carter sobbed when she realized it. The walls are eating the paper, eating the proof. The drawing in E12. When they checked Mr. H's cell, his drawing had shifted again. The rectangle was now wide open. Inside it, faint lines suggested multiple stick figures vanishing into the black. The caption read, "More." The decision detective Colin Ward had grown tired of chasing echoes. Patients vanished, records erased, drawings multiplied, but none of it provided proof. "I need to see it for myself," he told Finch. "You've seen enough," she snapped back. "Not like this." He pointed at the cell door. "Whatever happens, it happens in there." "If I sit in that bed, I'll know." Finch muttered, "Or you'll be the next missing file." But Ward had already signed himself in. The empty cell. At 11:45 p.m., Ward entered cell E12. The bed was freshly made, the slippers aligned, the wall scarred faintly by years of scratching. Carter handed him a flashlight. "Don't turn it off. If the lights fail, don't let it go dark." Ward managed a grim smile. Comforting advice. The door shut, iron bolts locking him in. The waiting. For the first hour, nothing. The walls breathed silence. The corridor beyond was quiet. Ward forced himself to take notes. 0017. Silence. 0033. No tapping. 0041. Faint draft near wall. At 1:06 a.m., the tapping began. The inside out. It wasn't the familiar rhythm. This time it came from behind him. No, beneath him. No, inside him. The taps reverberated through his ribs, his skull, his teeth. He dropped the pen, clutching his chest. He realized with horror that the rhythm matched his heartbeat. Tap, 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 slower than his pulse, as though something inside the wall was keeping time for him. The voice. Then the whisper came, not muffled like before, but clear, inches from his ear. "Colin, sit still. Don't breathe. We're almost through." Ward spun, flashlight beam slicing the plaster. Nothing. The wall looked smooth, but shadows rippled across it like water. The glimpse. At 1:37, his flashlight flickered. For a split second, the beam illuminated something pressed flat against the wall. A face. Gray eyes, mouth moving silently in sync with the tapping. It wasn't Mr. H. It wasn't Harold. It was Colin Ward's own face. The collapse. He staggered back, gasping, flashlight clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, the cell was dark, and in that instant, he felt the wall breathe warm against his cheek, like a mouth opening. Soon. The light sputtered back, and the plaster was blank again. The rescue. At 2:05, Finch unlocked the door. Ward stumbled out, drenched in sweat, hands trembling. "What did you see?" she demanded. Ward could barely speak. He looked back at the cell, voice hoarse. "Me." The drawing. That morning, the drawing had changed again. The rectangle was gone. In its place was a mirror. Beneath it, one word: you. The first malfunction. On November 22nd, at precisely 12:00 noon, every door on Ward E unlocked at once. Bolts clicked open in unison, echoing down the hall like a choir of steel. Orderlies panicked, rushing to slam doors shut, but within minutes the locks reset themselves, sealing again without human touch. Technicians swore the system couldn't do that. It's mechanical. No power surge explains simultaneous release. The clocks. Later that day, staff noticed the clocks in Hollowmere ticking backward. The ward clock rewound 5 minutes, then jumped forward 2. Nurse Carter's watch spun half a revolution before freezing. "Doctor." Price swore he lost 20 minutes, like a page ripped from a book. Inmates screamed, clutching their heads. One shouted, "Time's gone rotten! The walls are chewing it!" The patients. By evening, chaos reigned. Patients in 3 wards woke simultaneously from sedation, thrashing, shouting the same phrase. "They're hungry. Don't let them in." When Finch asked who they were, one patient whispered, "The ones between the ticks. The ones who eat the seconds you don't notice." The corridor incident. At 1:11 a.m., the corridor outside E12 filled with pounding, louder than ever before. Dust rained down in thick clouds. Detective Ward, standing watch, swore he saw handprints blooming across the plaster, dozens at once, stretching outward, pressing as though hundreds of people crowded inside the wall. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence. The handprints faded like mist. The doctor breaks. Dr. Price finally snapped. In a staff meeting, he raved, "We've been documenting nothing. Every word is stolen. Every chart is eaten. We are not studying this patient. We are feeding it." Administrators hushed him, calling it exhaustion. But afterward, Carter whispered to Finch, "He's right. Every note, every report. They vanish. But it's not random. It's a meal. The walls consume memory like food." The drawing. That morning, the drawing in E12 shifted again. No figures, no rectangle, just a spiral, curling inward endlessly. Beneath it, 2 words, "Always hungry." The realization. Ward closed his notebook slowly, knowing the words wouldn't last. "We thought it wanted out," he muttered. Finch asked, "And?" Ward's voice was hollow. "It wants in." The failure. On November 23rd, just after midnight, the asylum's power failed. Lights snapped off in unison. The hum of the radiators died. Even the emergency exit signs went dark. The backup generator, tested monthly, refused to start. For the first time in decades, Hollowmere was swallowed whole by night. The dark candles and flashlights flickered weakly against endless corridors. Nurse Carter clutched hers so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It feels thicker," she whispered. Detective Ward agreed. The dark in Hollowmere wasn't absence. It pressed. It breathed as though alive. The footsteps. At 12:14 a.m., the first sound came. Not tapping, not pounding. Footsteps. Measured, steady, circling the nurse's station. Step. 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 They didn't echo in the hall. They came from the walls themselves, sliding along plaster, pacing like a predator. Finch drew her revolver. "Someone's in here." But Ward's voice shook. "No. Someone's between here." The circle. The steps multiplied. One set became two. Two became 6. Soon, the walls throbbed with unseen movement, countless feet pacing. Every staff member in Ward E froze, listening as the sounds looped around them, faster and faster, until it felt like the asylum itself was running laps inside its skin. One patient screamed, "They're circling us, waiting for the lights to die completely." The whispers. Then came the voices, faint at first. Not words, just the shape of words, brushing ears like cold breath. Carter clamped her hands over her ears. Finch whispered, "What are they saying?" Ward answered, pale. "They're not talking. They're counting." The clock without hands. In the darkness, the corridor clock face glowed faintly. But its hands were gone, erased, leaving only a blank circle. The glass shivered. A hairline crack spread. Inside the glass, just for a moment, Finch swore she saw an eye staring back. The return of power. At 3:06 a.m., the lights snapped on. The footsteps stopped. The whispers cut off. The walls stilled. Everything looked ordinary again, except for the nurses' station floor, where a ring of dusty footprints circled their chairs. They were barefoot, too large to belong to any patient. The drawing. When they dared check E12, the spiral had changed. Now it spread outward, filling half the wall. Beneath it, scrawled jaggedly, "We walked." The morning after. On November 24th, Hollowmere awoke still rattled from the blackout. But Ward E faced something worse. At 7:12 a.m., an orderly found patient Stephen Mallory, age 29, lying in his bed. Eyes open, mouth slack, body cold. The bed was made neatly beneath him, as though someone had tucked him in after death. The examination Dr. Price performed the initial check. His hands shook as he listened for breath that wasn't there. No wounds, no bruises, no blood. But Mallory's chest was sunken, caved in slightly, like a collapsed balloon. Price whispered, "This isn't natural." The autopsy. The body was moved to Hollowmere's small morgue. Finch insisted on attending. Ward stayed too, notebook in hand. When Price made the first incision, his scalpel slid through flesh too easily, as if the tissue offered no resistance. And inside, nothing. The lungs were gone, the heart absent. Even the stomach and liver had vanished. But there were no cuts, no signs of surgical removal. The organs simply weren't there, It was as though someone had reached in with invisible hands and erased them from existence. The witness. The orderly who discovered Mallory swore he had heard tapping outside the man's cell at 3 a.m. The same rhythm as always. But this time, he claimed, the taps were from both sides of the wall at once, syncing together like two hands clapping. He hadn't reported it, terrified he'd be mocked. Now his silence felt like guilt. The records again. By afternoon, Mallory's chart had begun to fade. His name smudged from the register, his photo dulled, as though drained of color. Carter clutched the photo desperately. If it vanishes, we won't even remember his face. She tried copying it by hand. By the next day, her sketchbook page was blank. The staff fracture Hollowmere split into two camps. The believers, Carter, Ward, Finch, convinced the asylum itself was consuming people. The deniers, administrators insisting Mallory had been transferred, despite a body in the morgue. But by evening, even the body was gone. The morgue slab lay empty, sheet folded neatly. The drawing. When they checked cell E12, the spiral had grown so large it touched the ceiling. In its center was now a crude outline of a human body, hollow inside. Beneath it, a new word appeared. Fed. The dread ward whispered, "It's feeding." First the nameless, then Harold, now Mallory, each time more complete. Carter trembled. What happens when it isn't satisfied? Doctor. Price, face gray, answered flatly, "Then it takes us all." The Clue Detective Sergeant Julia Finch refused to accept that Mallory's vanishing organs, or his missing corpse, could be clerical errors. "If the walls are feeding," she told Ward, "we need to know what's inside them." She went digging, not in patient files, those were always erased, but in something more tangible. The asylum's architecture. The archives. In the county records office, Finch requested Hollowmere's original construction blueprints from 1894. The clerk wheeled out a bundle of rolled parchment, brittle with age. The plans were intricate: wards, stairwells, cell blocks, and then she saw it. Behind Ward E, directly where cell E12 sat, was a square chamber, windowless, doorless. A space with no access points. Yet the walls around it were 3 feet thick, as though sealing it away deliberately. On the margin was a faint annotation in handwritten ink. Observation room, bricked, 1901. Do not reopen. The discrepancy. Finch compared the original plans with modern schematics kept by Hollowmere's administrators. In the updated files, the chamber wasn't there. The space was listed simply as solid wall. Ward muttered when she showed him. So they knew. Over 80 years ago, they knew something lived inside. The whisper of history. Further digging revealed a short newspaper clipping from 1901. Local asylum halts expansion after structural concerns. Workmen refuse further duties after hearing voices within foundation walls. Administration denies superstition. No follow-up article was ever published. The return to E12. That night, Finch, Ward, and Carter gathered inside cell E12. Ward pressed his palm against the east wall. "So behind this, there's a room," Carter whispered, "or a prison." The tapping began almost instantly. Louder now, urgent, as though their acknowledgement had excited it. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm shook plaster dust loose, raining over their shoulders. The choice, Finch's voice was firm. "If we find a way in, maybe we stop this. Maybe it's not the patient at all. Maybe it's whatever's trapped inside." Ward stared at the wall, his own reflection flickering in cracks of moonlight. "I'm not sure," he muttered. "What if it isn't trapped? What if it's waiting?" The drawing. That morning, the spiral on the wall had morphed again. In its center now was a crude square, unmistakably a room. Inside the square, a single eye stared outward. Beneath it, a word scrawled jaggedly, "Open." The technician's resolve technician Gary Holt had seen enough anomalies on Hollowmere's cameras to convince him that the problem wasn't mechanical. When Finch showed him the hidden blueprints, his face went pale. So there is something back there. Against every rule, he offered, "Let me drill."
"Just enough to see." Ward objected. "If it's sealed, it was sealed for a reason." But Holt shook his head. "And if we don't open it, how many more vanish?"
The attempt on the night of November 25th, after most administrators had left, Holt set up a power drill inside cell E12. Carter stood by with a flashlight. Ward and Finch kept watch in the corridor. The moment the drill bit touched plaster, the tapping stopped. Silence. For the first time in weeks, the walls were utterly still. Holt exhaled, whispering, "It knows." The breach. The drill chewed through plaster, spitting dust. At 3 inches deep, the bit shuddered violently, as though striking something dense. "Stone," Holt muttered. He pressed harder. Then came the hiss. A rush of cold air poured from the tiny hole, damp and fetid, like breath exhaled after decades. Carter gagged. "It smells like rot." The eye Holt bent close, peering into the hole with his penlight. A heartbeat later, he screamed. He dropped the drill, stumbling back, clutching his face. Blood leaked from his left eye. Ward dragged him out into the corridor. "What did you see?" Holt choked, shaking. It looked back. The aftermath. The drill bit was twisted, as though wrenched by unseen force. The hole itself remained, no wider than a coin, but from it came a faint sound, not tapping this time. Breathing, slow, patient, waiting. Holt's eye. At the infirmary, Holt's damaged eye was examined. The pupil was fractured, iris clouded gray. Doctors muttered it looked like advanced cataract, but it had happened in seconds. Holt whispered again and again, "It was watching. It knows us now." The drawing. The next morning, the spiral on the wall had grown around the crude square. Inside the square, the eye was larger, clearer, detailed. And beneath it, a new caption appeared. "We see." The morning after. On November 26th, Nurse Carter was the first to check cell E12. The coin-sized hole Holt had drilled was no longer small. It had widened, jagged edges stretching outward like cracked glass. Now it was the size of a fist, and still expanding. She dropped her flashlight in horror. "It's opening itself." The sound. From the hole came a low hum, almost too low for human ears. Not a voice, not exactly. But when Carter pressed her stethoscope against the wall, the vibration formed a pattern, a rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. The walls themselves were echoing the patient's code. The camera feed Holt, his one good eye covered in gauze, refused to enter E12 again. But he monitored the corridor camera obsessively. At 2:03 a.m., the tape caught it. The hole widened visibly, plaster cracking outward, without human touch. And for 3 frames, something like fingers curled briefly over the edge before retracting. The fear staff whispered about moving patients out of Ward E. The administrators refused. "We won't fuel hysteria," they said. But already, 4 patients had to be restrained after screaming the same words in unison. "The door is opening." The visit ward and Finch stood in E12 that evening, watching dust crumble from the hole's edges. "It's not breaking," Ward muttered. "It's peeling, like skin." Finch shivered. "Then what happens when it's finished peeling?" From deep inside came a faint laugh, soft, chilling. Ward clenched his fists. "It wants us to wait. It wants us to watch."
The spiral changes. By morning, the pencil spiral that had consumed the wall was gone. In its place was a crude sketch of an open door, and beside it, jagged words scrawled deeper than before. Not long now. The staff divide. Dr. Price demanded they seal the breach with concrete immediately. Carter begged him not to. If you seal it, it will only push harder. At least this way we see it coming. Ward, exhausted, muttered, "Either way, it's not us deciding anymore. The wall chooses." The whisper. That night, Carter swore she heard the hole whisper her name. Not Nurse Carter, not Elaine, but the name she hadn't used since childhood. A name only her late father had called her. She fled the room in tears. The night of silence. On November 27th, Hollowmere felt unnaturally still. No screams, no pounding, not even the usual shuffle of restless patients. Dr. Price said at dawn, "It's too quiet." He was right. The empty beds. At 6 o'clock a.m. roll call revealed 5 patients missing across 3 different wards. 2 from Ward C, 1 from Ward B, 2 from the long-term dormitory on Ward D. Every bed was made, slippers aligned, personal belongings untouched, each room locked from the outside. The panic orderlies tore through the halls, guards searched every floor, police were called, but the asylum was sealed tight. No open doors, no broken windows. The only evidence was dust scattered faintly beneath several walls, as though something had slipped through the cracks. The witness one patient in Ward D, trembling and incoherent, claimed he saw one of the missing men fold into the wall. He just leaned back like falling into water. The plaster rippled. Then he was gone. When staff checked the wall, he indicated it was warm to the touch. The camera's technician Holt reviewed the corridor tapes. Every feed showed the same anomaly: a flicker, static, then empty beds. But at 3:03 a.m., the camera outside E12 caught something different. A long shadow stretched from the widening hole across the corridor, far longer than any human body. It touched the opposite wall before dissolving. The records. By afternoon, the files for all 5 missing patients had begun to blur. By evening, their names were erased completely. Ward tried to write them down in his private notebook. When he opened it again, only blank lines remained, as though the paper itself refused their existence. The staff divide deepens. The administration insisted the vanishings were escapes, though impossible. Staff whispered openly about the walls feeding again. Carter told Finch, "It's spreading. It's not just E12 anymore. The asylum is full of doors." The hole. By midnight, the hole in E12 had widened to the size of a human head. Ward swore he saw movement inside. Not one face, but many, pressed against the dark, mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for air. When Carter shone her flashlight, the faces vanished. The drawing. The wall drawing changed again. This time, it wasn't crude pencil. It was carved, gouged deep into the plaster. A crowd of stick figures stood around an open doorway. Above them, one word: come. The unthinkable. By November 28th, the asylum was unraveling. 5 patients gone, files erased, a hole yawning wider every night. Staff whispered that no one was safe anymore. "It's only patients," the administrators insisted. "We're protected." That lie lasted less than a day. The corridor. At 10:43 a.m., orderly Matthew Keene walked the wardy corridor with a medication tray. Detective Ward and Sergeant Finch were present, interviewing a nurse nearby. The corridor camera was rolling. The vanishing Keene reached the midpoint of the hall. He stopped, frowning as though hearing something. The medication tray slid from his hands, rattling across the floor. He staggered backward, not pulled, not grabbed, simply absorbed. His back touched the east wall. The plaster rippled like water. And then he was gone. No scream, no struggle, no trace. The camera evidence on tape, it was even worse. Frame 1, Keen carrying the tray. Frame 2, his body blurring at the edges. Frame 3, gone. The wall smooth. The tray remained, lying perfectly still as if nothing had happened. The witnesses. Nurse Carter sobbed, clutching Finch's arm. "He didn't fight. He just dissolved." Ward muttered hoarsely, "It's escalating. The walls don't care who anymore." Administrators ordered silence, labeling it a stress-related misperception. But too many had seen. Too many knew. The hole again. That evening, the hole in E12 had grown to the size of a doorway. Inside, shapes moved. Not human. Too tall, too thin, heads bending at impossible angles. Ward swore one of them was watching him, tilting its head, mimicking his breath. Holt's breakdown technician. Holt, bandaged eye twitching, smashed one of the monitors with a wrench. "They're not cameras anymore," he shouted. "They're windows, and we're the ones inside." He had to be sedated. The drawing. By morning, the gouged sketch on E12's wall had changed once more. No spiral, no rectangle. Now it showed dozens of stick figures, staff and patients alike, walking calmly into a black doorway. Above it, the word, "Together." The fear. Finch whispered, "It's not picking. It's pulling us all." Ward, pale and exhausted, replied, "Then the question isn't who's next. It's how long until it's everyone." The blackout returns. On November 29th, just after 1 o'clock a.m., Hollowmere went dark again. Not just the lights, not just the generator. Every flashlight, every emergency lantern, every electrical spark snuffed out as though swallowed. The asylum was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like drowning. The opening in cell E12, staff huddled together. Ward, Finch, Carter, and 2 orderlies. The hole in the wall began to stretch. Plaster crumbled noiselessly, widening into an arch. Within seconds, it wasn't a hole anymore. It was a doorway, a rectangle of deeper black, darker than the unlit room itself. The breathing from beyond came slow, steady breathing. It wasn't human. It was too vast, too resonant, like lungs filling the size of the asylum itself. The sound shook dust from the ceiling, made the floor shudder beneath their feet. One orderly whimpered, "It's alive in there." Ward whispered back, "Or they all are." The glimpse. For one terrible moment, the darkness inside the doorway flickered, like lightning behind storm clouds, and they saw shapes, figures, dozens, maybe hundreds, standing in a vast corridor of stone, thin, faceless, swaying in rhythm. In the center stood the man they once called Mr. H. Palms pressed against the far wall, counting, lips moving, waiting. When he lifted his head, his gray eyes locked on Carter. Late. The pull. The air shifted. A current tugged toward the doorway, soft at first, then harder. A silent suction. Papers flew from clipboards. Hair whipped forward. One orderly stumbled too close and had to be dragged back by Finch. Inside the black, the faceless figures began to move, shuffling toward the opening. The whispers' voices spilled from the doorway. Not shouts, not screams, whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping. Each staff member heard something different. Ward heard his late father's voice. Finch heard her own child calling. Carter heard herself, begging to be let in. The whispers grew louder, forming a single word. Through. The closing. Then, as suddenly as it began, the suction stopped. The breathing ceased. The doorway collapsed inward, plaster slamming shut, leaving only dust and silence. The wall looked whole again, smooth, solid. But none of them believed it was gone. The drawing. The next morning, on the east wall of E12, a new sketch appeared in jagged lines. An open archway, stick figures stepping through. Beneath it, a single word remained. Soon. The Exodus. By November 30th, Hollowmere no longer resembled an asylum. 6 nurses had resigned in a single morning. 3 orderlies walked out mid-shift, refusing to return. The administrators, pale and defiant, insisted, "This is temporary. We must preserve order." But no one believed them. Everyone knew. Order was gone. The patients without staff, the patients began to spiral. In Ward B, a man smashed his head repeatedly into the plaster, screaming, "Let me in before it's too late." In Ward D, 4 women sang in unison, repeating the word "through" for hours until their throats bled. In Ward C, someone gouged a spiral into their own arm with a spoon. Sedatives ran short. Chaos spread faster than containment. The riot. On the night of December 1st, Ward E erupted. Patients clawed at walls, overturning beds, biting at plaster as though desperate to tear holes themselves. One orderly swore he saw hands reaching back, pale arms slipping from cracks to pull the rioters closer. By dawn, 3 patients were missing, their names already gone from the register. The staff crumbled. Nurse Carter's health collapsed. She hadn't slept in days. She spoke in whispers, mimicking the tapping, "Doctor." Price began drinking openly on rounds, muttering, "It's not madness, it's contagion. Memory itself is sick." Technician Holt was found in the surveillance room, monitors smashed. His gauze-covered eye oozed. He repeated the same phrase, "It's not behind the wall anymore. It's in the film. It sees us when we blink." He was sedated. Again. The corridor incident. Ward and Finch tried to maintain structure, but during an interview with a patient, the corridor light flickered. For 3 seconds, Finch disappeared from Ward's sight, not walked away, not faded, just erased, as if she'd never stood there. When she reappeared mid-sentence, she hadn't realized anything was missing. Ward's hand shook so badly he dropped his notebook. The drawing. The wall of E12 changed again. Not a sketch this time, but a sprawling scrawl stretching across the plaster. Stick figures filled the wall, hundreds of them, crowded shoulder to shoulder, all of them facing forward toward the viewer. Beneath, one phrase scratched deep enough to gouge plaster dust. "We are awake." The fear ward whispered, "It's not a patient anymore. It's not even the walls. The asylum itself is awake." Finch's face was pale, her voice trembling. "Then what happens when it stands up?" The first loop. On December 2nd, Detective Colin Ward entered the Ward E corridor at 9:03 a.m. At 9:07, he watched himself walk past again. Same coat, same stride, same notebook tucked beneath his arm. The duplicate didn't look at him, didn't slow. It simply vanished around the corner. When Ward checked his watch, it was still 9:03. The duplicate's Nurse Carter reported seeing 2 of Finch simultaneously, one in the station, one walking the corridor. She blinked, and the second Finch was gone. When the real Finch asked what time it was, Carter sobbed, "All of them. All the hours. They're happening at once." The mid-sentence. Vanishings. Patients began disappearing not in their beds, not behind locked doors, but mid-conversation. One man, recounting his childhood, froze on the word mother. His lips still formed the sound. His tongue moved, but his body blurred, translucent, until only the word remained. When he vanished, the word mother lingered in the air for seconds, whispered from inside the walls. The clocks. Every clock in Hollowmere spun wildly. Ward C's clock rewound 3 hours, then leapt forward 7. The corridor clock above E12 ran in spirals, hands twisting in circles until they snapped off. Finch's wristwatch stopped entirely, yet she swore she still heard ticking beneath her skin. The corridor footage technician Holt, one eye clouded, played the cameras on loop. The feeds now showed impossible scenes. Carter walking backward while her shadow walked forward. Finch split into two, one pacing calmly, one frozen mid-step. Ward staring into the camera, eyes hollow, though he had never entered the room. Holt muttered, "It's not recording us. It's recording what we'll be, or what we were." Dr. Price's break. In a drunken fury, Dr. Price shouted in the ward, "Time doesn't move forward here. We're insects on a broken clock, circling the same second forever." Then he collapsed, weeping. Carter had to drag him away. The drawing. The wall of E12 had changed again. Now it was covered in overlapping spirals, interlocking like gears of a clock. In the center, instead of numbers, were words scratched over and over. Now, 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 now. The realization Ward whispered as he traced the gouges with his fingers. We thought it was a countdown. It was never counting down. It was circling, waiting for the second to break. Finch asked, terrified, "And when it breaks?" Ward didn't answer. The first loss. On the morning of December 3rd, Nurse Carter led Finch down the east wing to check Ward C. When they turned the corner, the hallway ended abruptly in smooth plaster. No door, no windows, no ward. The corridor simply stopped, as though the rest of the building had never been built. Carter dropped her clipboard. Ward C. It was here yesterday. Finch touched the plaster. It was warm, faintly pulsing, as though it breathed. The records erased. When they checked the staff roster, every name assigned to Ward C was gone. The daily schedule skipped from Ward B to Ward D without blank space, as though C had never existed. Only Carter sobbed, whispering, "There were 23 patients in there. I knew their faces. I swear it." But even in her own notebook, their names had vanished. The corridor collapse. That night, Ward and Finch patrolled together. At 2:11 a.m., they heard the asylum groan, a deep grinding sound like stone shifting underground. When they returned to the administrative offices, they found half the corridor missing. Desks, filing cabinets, telephones, gone. In their place, smooth wall, seamless. The survivor. An orderly was found screaming in a supply closet. He claimed he had watched the wall roll toward him, swallowing beds, furniture, and patients like a wave. "I ran into the closet," he wept. "When I opened the door again, the hall was gone." The camera evidence technician Holt replayed the corridor feed. The footage showed staff walking normally. Then, in one frame, the corridor simply ended. The people walking it were erased mid-stride, replaced by blank plaster. Ward slammed his fist against the console. It's not deleting patients anymore. It's deleting reality. Dr. Price's terror. Dr. Price locked himself in his office, muttering to anyone who knocked, "Buildings are memory. Bricks remember what they're built for. When the walls forget, the rooms fall away." By morning, his office too had vanished. The drawing on the wall of E12, the crude spirals were gone.
Now the entire plaster surface had been darkened by charred smears, as if burned from within. In the center, scratched deep, bigger. The fear Finch whispered, "It's eating the asylum piece by piece." Ward's face was ashen. Then one day we'll turn a corner and the exit itself will be gone. The plan. By December 4th, panic had overtaken what was left of Hollowmere's staff. Finch, Ward, Carter, and 3 remaining orderlies agreed. They had to leave. The asylum wasn't a building anymore. It was a mouth, and it was closing. Ward clenched his jaw. If we stay, it takes us... If we run, maybe we warn someone. No one argued. The attempt at dawn, they armed themselves with flashlights, ropes, and bolt cutters. The main gate of Hollowmere, tall iron, chained shut, had stood since the 1920s. Beyond it lay the forest road and freedom. They marched together, breath visible in the frozen morning air. But when they reached the courtyard, they stopped dead. The missing gate. The gate was gone. The brick pillars that had once held it were fused together, smooth stone stretching unbroken across the perimeter wall. Where the iron bars should have been was only seamless masonry. No exit, no cracks, no sign there had ever been a gate at all. Carter dropped to her knees. It won't even let us leave. The perimeter. They tried the east wing fire door, but it opened onto blank plaster. The west stairwell ended in smooth wall where the emergency exit should have been. Even the windows had grown strange. Through the glass, they saw not the forest or the road, but only blackness, like paint smeared across the world outside. The Test 1 orderly hurled a chair through the window. It shattered outward, but no air, no light, no sound came through, just void. The chair dissolved mid-fall, fragments vanishing into black. The realization Ward pressed his hands against the cold brick. It's not just swallowing rooms anymore. It's sealing us in. Finch whispered, "We're not inside Hollowmere. Hollowmere is inside them." When asked what she meant, she only shook her head. The collapse of hope. They retreated back into the courtyard. Holt, wild-eyed, laughed bitterly. "You don't walk out of a stomach, you get digested." Carter covered her ears, rocking. No, there has to be another way. But even she knew. The asylum had decided. The drawing on the wall of E12, a new image appeared overnight. This time it showed the entire outline of Hollowmere Asylum, sketched like a child's blocky drawing of a house. But the building was drawn inside the outline of a vast human figure, its arms encircling it like a cage. Underneath, one word: ours. The decision. On December 5th, after days of vanishings and sealed exits, the survivors gathered in the nurses' station. Ward's voice was hoarse but resolute. "If it won't let us out, then we take it down. Burn it. Leave nothing left for it to feed on." Carter wept. "You can't burn walls. You can't burn time." But Holt, bandaged eye wild, hands trembling, whispered, "We can try. Better ash than hunger." The preparation. They scavenged supplies, kerosene from the maintenance shed, blankets torn into makeshift torches, matches from Dr. Price's desk. They poured fuel across Ward E, the floors slick with fumes. Carter hesitated at the threshold of E12. "If we do this, it might let something out." Ward gritted his teeth. "If we don't, it keeps us in." The ignition. At 11:57 p.m., Finch struck the first match. The flame hissed, small but real. She dropped it onto the fuel-soaked floor. The fire caught, roaring upward, consuming wood, curtains, paper charts. For a moment, relief washed over them. The asylum was burning. The twist. But then the fire bent. The flames curled sideways, clinging to the walls in strange shapes. They didn't spread outward. They spread inward, sucked into cracks, pulled toward E12. The blaze licked across the plaster like handwriting, forming spirals of living fire. Carter screamed, "It's eating the fire, too!" The hallucinations. As the flames twisted, the survivors saw shapes inside the fire. Gray eyes staring through the smoke. Faceless figures walking calmly within the blaze. The outline of Hollowmere itself, burning from the inside out. Finch dropped her torch in horror. "We're not burning it. It's burning us." The collapse. The fire devoured fuel, yet nothing charred. Walls stood unblackened, untouched. Instead, the survivors felt heat inside their own chests, lungs scalding, skin blistering from within, as though the asylum had turned the flames against them. Holt fell to the floor, clutching his bandaged eye, screaming, "It's lighting us instead! We're the fuel!" The snuffing. At 12:14 a.m., the fire vanished, not faded, not burned out. Simply gone, swallowed whole by the walls. The halls were clean, no smoke, no ash, no scorch marks, only silence. The drawing. When they returned to E12, the wall bore a new scrawl, written in black soot, a single stick figure engulfed in flames. Beneath it, one word remained: failed. The realization. Ward whispered, throat raw, "We thought we could destroy it, but you don't destroy hunger. You only feed it more." Finch stared at him, terrified. Then it won't stop. Not until it has everything. The last night. On December 6th, only 5 remained. Detective Colin Ward, Sergeant Julia Finch, Nurse Elaine Carter, Dr. Price, and the broken-eyed technician Holt. The asylum was quiet again. Too quiet. No pounding. No whispers. Carter said softly, "It always goes still before it eats." No one laughed. The final record Ward tried one last time to write in his notebook. "We are alive. We are still here. Hollowmere cannot erase us if we remember." But even as his pen scratched, the ink faded. The words dissolved before his eyes. Only the indentations remained. Faint grooves in the paper, like a memory already half erased. The corridor. At 2:00 a.m., the walls began to move. Not cracking, not collapsing, simply sliding inward. Corridors shortened. Doors vanished. Ceilings pressed lower. It was as though the asylum was folding itself around them, drawing tighter with every breath. Holt laughed, wild and broken. "We're not in a building. We're in its mouth." Then the wall behind him opened like wet paper, and he was gone. The mirror. In cell E12, the doorway stretched wide once more. But this time, it wasn't dark inside. It was reflective. A mirror. Ward saw himself. Finch saw herself. Carter saw her father. Price saw a young man he had once been, proud and unbroken. The reflections whispered in unison. "Come through." The pull. The suction returned, stronger than before. Papers, chairs, torches, all dragged toward the mirror doorway. Carter clung to the bed frame, screaming. Finch held Ward's arm, but his body was already blurring at the edges, dissolving into shadow. Price staggered forward willingly, whispering, "It's not death. It's return." The walls swallowed him whole. The last words. Finch's grip slipped. Ward's notebook tore free, pages scattering like feathers into the doorway. His last words rasped before he vanished. "If you find this, remember us." Then he was gone. Carter followed. Then Finch. only silence remained. The aftermath. When investigators arrived weeks later, Hollowmere stood empty. No staff, no patients, no records. The building was pristine. No scorch marks, no signs of struggle, as though abandoned decades ago. The official report closed the file. Facility decommissioned. No occupants present. But locals swore that on winter nights, if you pressed your ear to the east wall of the ruins, you could still hear it. Tap, 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 tap. The last drawing. Carved deep into the plaster of cell E12, the only mark left behind was a single word, etched where the spiral had once been. Silence. Epilogue. The vanishing patient of Hollowmere Asylum was never identified. The files are gone. The names are gone. Even the asylum itself, decades later, was torn down and built over. But sometimes, when the clocks falter, people swear they see a door where none should be, and behind it, gray eyes waiting,